The ancient corridors of Westminster Palace held their secrets well, but tonight they seemed to whisper of betrayal. Outside, London's October rain drummed against Gothic windows, while inside, the ornate chambers echoed with the footsteps of night security making their rounds. It was 2:30 a.m. when Rishi Sunak's secure phone shattered the silence of number 10's master bedroom, its encrypted ringtone cutting through dreams of economic recovery and post-Brexit stability. Sunak's eyes snapped open, his banker's instincts immediately alert. Years of managing financial crises had taught him that calls at this hour never brought good news. He glanced at the caller ID and felt his stomach tighten. Emmanuel Macron. The French president's perfectly coiffed image filled the screen, but when Sunak answered, the voice that emerged was anything but composed. "Rishi, I need your help urgently." There was something in Macron's tone that made Sunak sit up straighter, his feet finding the cold hardwood floor. The usual theatrical confidence was gone, replaced by something that sounded dangerously close to panic. Through the phone, Sunak could hear the distant sound of voices speaking rapid French, the shuffling of papers, the unmistakable atmosphere of a crisis center in full operation. "Emmanuel, what happened?" "Speak clearly," Sunak said, his voice carrying that cool composure inherited from years of navigating both corporate boardrooms and political battlefields. His Indian heritage had taught him patience. His British education had taught him skepticism. Both were about to be tested. "The EU's financial system is on the brink of collapse," Macron whispered, his accent more pronounced than usual, a tell that Sunak recognized from their previous encounters during tense negotiations. "There are leaked documents from major banks. A secret credit network involving Europe's 12 largest financial institutions is about to be exposed." Sunak moved to the window, looking out at the empty streets of London. The city's financial district lay dark and quiet, but he knew that across the Channel, European markets were already reacting to whatever crisis Macron was describing. "And the person responsible," Macron's voice cracked slightly. "It's not me. But the Financial Times will publish everything in 3 hours. And you, Rishi, you're the only one who can stop this." The line fell silent, except for the sound of Macron's labored breathing. Sunak could picture the French president in his gilded office at the Élysée Palace, probably pacing between the tall windows that overlooked the Champs-Élysées, his usually immaculate appearance disheveled by whatever crisis had driven him to make this impossible call. "What can I do?" Sunak asked, though his mind was already racing through possibilities. "We're no longer EU members. That's exactly why we need London's financial power. The city can absorb the shock, stabilize the markets, prevent a complete collapse. You can save Europe," or the line went dead. Not disconnected, not lost signal, but deliberately cut. Sunak stared at the phone, its screen now dark, reflecting his own concerned expression. Through his window, he could see the early morning light beginning to creep across London's skyline, illuminating a city that had once ruled half the world and now found itself being begged for salvation by the very continent that had celebrated its departure. But something felt wrong, desperately wrong. In all his years of knowing Emmanuel Macron, through Brexit negotiations and post-Brexit tensions, he had never heard the French president sound genuinely afraid. Macron was many things: ambitious, theatrical, sometimes ruthless. But he was not a man who panicked, which meant either the crisis was worse than anything Europe had ever faced, or there was something else at play, something that would soon make that middle-of-the-night phone call look very different than it seemed. The silence of number 10 was broken by the soft buzz of Sunak's secure communications device. His chief of staff would never contact him at this hour, unless something was catastrophically wrong, but the message that appeared on his encrypted screen wasn't from his team. It was from an anonymous sender using diplomatic-level encryption protocols that only a handful of people in the world could access. The Macron call was recorded. "He's lying about the banks. The real crisis is his own making, and he's trying to drag Britain down with him." Attached were financial documents that made Sunak's hands tremble as he read. Secret French government bonds, algorithmic trading programs, currency manipulation strategies, all backed by British pension funds without Parliament's knowledge or consent. The documents showed months of systematic financial warfare, with French algorithms programmed to short British currency while Macron publicly supported European unity in press conferences. Sunak sank into the leather armchair by his window, his mind reeling from the implications. If these documents were authentic, then Emmanuel Macron hadn't just been criticizing Brexit, he had been actively profiting from it, using British economic vulnerability as collateral for French debt while betting against the pound's recovery. The betrayal cut deeper than politics. It was personal. He and Macron had sat across from each other during countless diplomatic dinners, had shared private conversations about their families, their hopes for their country's futures. Sunak had even defended Macron against critics who called him opportunistic. Now those critics looked prophetic. His phone rang again, the familiar tone indicating a call from Jeremy Hunt, his chancellor. Sunak could hear the stress in Hunt's voice before he even finished his greeting. "Prime Minister, we have an emergency situation. French financial authorities just implemented what they're calling technical maintenance on all cross-channel transaction systems. Every bank transfer, every trade, every pension payment between Britain and France has been frozen." The pieces were falling into place with terrifying clarity. Macron's midnight phone call hadn't been a plea for help. It had been the opening move in a carefully orchestrated financial attack. While claiming that Europe needed British assistance, French systems were simultaneously cutting Britain off from European markets, creating artificial pressure that could force Sunak into a desperate agreement. "How widespread is the freeze?" Sunak asked, though he already suspected the answer would be comprehensive. "Complete. Our intelligence suggests this isn't technical maintenance at all. The French Treasury has been planning this for weeks, possibly months. They're trying to force us into some kind of emergency financial arrangement." Sunak closed his eyes, his mind shifting into the analytical mode that had served him well during his years in banking. This was financial warfare disguised as a crisis of confidence. Macron was betting that Britain, cut off from European markets and facing what appeared to be a continental emergency, would agree to almost anything to restore stability. "Jeremy, contact the Bank of England immediately. Tell them to prepare for economic warfare. And contact our financial intelligence division. I want every French financial transaction monitored in real time." "Sir, are you saying President Macron is deliberately attacking British interests?" "I'm saying President Macron has just declared financial war on Britain, and he's trying to make us complicit in our own destruction." As Sunak ended the call, another message appeared on his secure device. This one carried an encryption signature he recognized immediately. Christine Lagarde, President of the European Central Bank. Her message was brief, but carried enormous implications. "Rishi, meet me in Geneva tomorrow morning. Alone. What I have to show you about Emmanuel will shock not just you, but the entire world. He's not just betraying Britain, he's betraying Europe itself." The web of deception was even more complex than Sunak had imagined, and Geneva held answers that would reshape his understanding of everything that had happened since Brexit. The morning mist rising from Lake Geneva created an almost ethereal atmosphere as Rishi Sunak's unmarked diplomatic vehicle wound through the Swiss city's pristine streets. He had traveled under the highest levels of security, telling only his closest protection detail and leaving his usual diplomatic entourage behind in London. The Four Seasons Hotel sat like a fortress of discretion overlooking the lake, the kind of place where world leaders met when they needed absolute privacy. Christine Lagarde waited in a soundproofed conference room on the top floor, her usually immaculate appearance showing signs of stress that Sunak had never seen before. The woman who commanded Europe's monetary policy looked like she hadn't slept in days, her designer suit wrinkled, her silver hair less perfectly styled than usual. Coffee cups and energy drink cans littered the table beside encrypted tablets and file folders marked with the highest classification levels. "Thank you for coming on such short notice," Lagarde said, her French accent thick with exhaustion. "What you're about to see will explain not just why Emmanuel called you 2 nights ago, but why the entire European project is in mortal danger." She gestured to the documents spread across the mahogany table like evidence at a crime scene. Financial charts, algorithmic trading records, communication transcripts, bank routing numbers, the paper trail of a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of European governance. For the past 8 months, Emmanuel has been conducting what can only be described as systematic financial terrorism against European Union member states, Lagarde began, her voice carrying the weight of someone revealing state secrets. "He's been using French Treasury algorithms to destabilize other nations' currencies, then profiting from the chaos through shell companies based in Luxembourg and Monaco." Sunak studied the documents, his banker's eye immediately recognizing the sophisticated nature of the operation. "This isn't just currency speculation, this is warfare." "Exactly, and Britain has been his primary target since the Queen's funeral. He saw your country's vulnerability during the royal transition and decided to exploit it for maximum profit." The timeline made horrifying sense. While Sunak had been managing the delicate balance of leadership transition and economic stability, Macron had been actively sabotaging British recovery efforts, betting billions against the pound while publicly expressing support for European unity. The leaked banking documents he mentioned during his call, Lagarde continued, sliding another folder across the table. They don't show European financial instability, they show his own criminal activities. He's been planning to release fake intelligence, suggesting that other European leaders, including you, were complicit in market manipulation. Sunak felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Swiss mountaineer. He was trying to make me an unwitting accomplice. Worse than that, if you had agreed to his emergency financial arrangement, you would have legally authorized the very transactions he's been using to attack British markets. Your signature would have made his theft retroactively legitimate under international banking law. The elegance of the trap was both impressive and terrifying. Macron hadn't just been planning to destroy British economic credibility. He had been engineering a scenario where Britain would voluntarily surrender its financial sovereignty while believing it was helping to save Europe. Lagarde pulled out her tablet, showing real-time financial data that made Sunak's blood run cold. Right now, as we speak, French algorithms are executing trades designed to crash the pound when London markets open. Unless something dramatic happens to disrupt his timeline, Britain will face a currency crisis that makes Black Wednesday look like a minor correction. Through the conference room windows, Lake Geneva stretched toward the distant Alps, peaceful and serene. But inside the room, two of the most powerful financial officials in the world were documenting the evidence of an economic war that could reshape the global order. "There's one more thing," Lagarde said, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. "Emmanuel isn't acting alone. He has allies in the German banking sector, partners in Italian finance, enablers throughout the European central banking system. This conspiracy goes deeper than one man's ambition." Sunak stood and walked to the window, his reflection ghost-like against the lake view. Below, tourists fed swans while joggers traced paths along the waterfront, all of them unaware that the stability of their continent was being decided in a hotel room above their heads. "What's his endgame?" Sunak asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Complete financial dominance over European monetary policy, with France as the undisputed leader and other nations reduced to economic vassalage, starting with Britain's destruction as an example of what happens to countries that challenge French economic supremacy." The scope of Macron's ambition was breathtaking in its audacity and terrifying in its potential consequences. The flight back to London felt interminable as Sunak processed the full scope of what Lagarde had revealed. At 35,000 feet above the English Channel, he stared down at waters that had once protected Britain from continental conquest, wondering if geography still mattered in an age of financial warfare. His secure phone buzzed constantly with encrypted updates from his economic team, each message painting a darker picture of coordinated attacks on British financial systems. By the time his RAF transport touched down at London City Airport, Sunak had made a decision that would either save Britain or destroy his own political career. Instead of responding defensively to Macron's manufactured crisis, he would turn the French president's own tactics against him with a precision that would make his banking background look like child's play compared to his political weaponry. "Gentlemen," Sunak announced as he entered the cabinet room an hour later, facing the worried expressions of his closest advisors, "we're about to teach Europe a masterclass in financial warfare." The room fell silent. Chancellor Jeremy Hunt leaned forward, his face showing the strain of managing a crisis he didn't fully understand. "Prime Minister, the French have escalated their attacks. The pound is under unprecedented pressure, and European markets are showing signs of coordinated manipulation." "Good," Sunak replied, a response that visibly startled his team. "Emmanuel Macron thinks he's playing chess while I'm playing checkers. He's about to discover that sometimes the best chess strategy is to flip the board entirely." His plan was elegant in its ruthlessness. Instead of denying the French allegations or defending against their attacks, Britain would do something unexpected. They would save European markets while simultaneously exposing every detail of French financial manipulation to the global media. "We're going to give President Macron exactly what he claims he wants," Sunak explained, his voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone who had found the perfect countermove. "We're going to stabilize European finance, but we're going to do it in a way that exposes his conspiracy while positioning Britain as Europe's financial savior." Within hours, Sunak had mobilized resources that Macron couldn't have anticipated. The Bank of England, the City of London's private banking networks, British pension funds, and even the royal family's private financial advisors were coordinated in an operation that would inject massive liquidity into European markets while documenting every suspicious French transaction in real time. The beauty of the strategy lay in its moral positioning. While Macron was actively trying to destabilize European finance for personal profit, Britain would be demonstrating that post-Brexit Britain was not only financially strong enough to save the continent, but principled enough to do so despite years of European hostility. "Phase 1 launches at European market opening," Sunak told his team. "We flood every major European exchange with British capital, preventing the collapse that Macron has orchestrated. But simultaneously, we're tracking every algorithm, every suspicious trade, every shell company transaction that led to this crisis. His communications director looked concerned. Prime Minister, if this goes wrong, if we're seen as interfering in European markets, then we'll be judged by history, Sunak interrupted. But if we do nothing, Emmanuel Macron will have successfully destroyed British economic credibility while enriching himself through financial terrorism. I'd rather be criticized for action than condemned for cowardice. By evening, the first phase was complete. British institutions had injected €50 billion into European markets, preventing the collapse that French algorithms had been designed to trigger. More importantly, British financial intelligence had documented every suspicious transaction, creating an unbreakable chain of evidence linking French government resources to market manipulation. The phone call from Macron came at exactly 11 p.m., his voice shaking with rage and something that sounded like genuine fear. "What have you done, Rishi? Do you realize you've just committed financial suicide?" Sunak's response was measured, deliberate, and devastating in its calm precision. "I've done exactly what you asked me to do, Emmanuel. I've prevented a European financial crisis. The question you should be asking is, are you prepared for what happens when the world sees how that crisis was created in the first place?" Dawn broke over London with an intensity that seemed to mirror the seismic shift about to ripple across global financial markets. In the glass towers of Canary Wharf, traders arrived to find their screens glowing with unprecedented data flows as British capital continued flooding into European exchanges. But more importantly, financial journalists across 3 continents were receiving carefully curated packages of evidence that would transform the morning's headlines from a story about European instability into an exposé of French financial terrorism. Sunak stood in his Downing Street office, coffee growing cold in his hands as he watched the sunrise paint the London skyline in shades of gold and crimson. His secure phone displayed a constant stream of updates from financial intelligence operatives across Europe, each message confirming that the trap he had set was closing with mathematical precision. The first headline appeared on the Financial Times website at 6:47 a.m. "British intervention saves EU markets as French manipulation exposed." Within minutes, every major news outlet was scrambling to match the story, their financial reporters working through leaked documents that showed months of systematic market manipulation orchestrated from the highest levels of French government. Sunak watched the television in his office as Emmanuel Macron appeared for an emergency press conference at the Élysée Palace. The French president's usual theatrical confidence had been replaced by something Sunak had never seen before: genuine fear. Macron's typically immaculate appearance was disheveled, his silver hair uncombed, his expensive suit wrinkled as if he had slept in it. Dark circles under his eyes suggested he hadn't slept at all. "These allegations are completely unfounded," Macron declared, but his voice lacked conviction. Behind him, Sunak could see French officials whispering urgently, their body language suggesting a government in crisis mode. France has always acted in the best interests of European financial stability, but the evidence was overwhelming. French treasury algorithms designed to destabilize British currency. Shell companies in Monaco and Luxembourg used to hide profits from market manipulation. Recorded conversations between Macron and French banking executives discussing strategies to bleed Britain dry and teach the Anglo-Saxons their place in the new European order. The most damaging revelation was a video conference recording where Macron laughed while describing how he planned to use Brexit vulnerabilities to finally put the British Empire where it belongs, in the grave. European leaders who had remained diplomatically neutral during Britain's Brexit departure suddenly found themselves scrambling to distance themselves from French actions. The German Chancellor issued a statement expressing deep concern about French market manipulation. The Italian Prime Minister called for full transparency in European financial operations. The Spanish President announced that Spain would review all financial agreements with France pending a full investigation. But Sunak's masterstroke wasn't just exposing Macron's conspiracy. It was the positioning of Britain's response. While European media focused on French betrayal, British intervention was being praised as principled leadership that transcended political grievances. Britain had saved European markets not to score political points, but because it was the right thing to do. The irony was perfect and intentional. Macron's attempt to demonstrate British weakness had instead showcased British strength, financial capability, and moral superiority. By evening, Christine Lagarde appeared on BBC News with an exclusive interview that would end any remaining doubt about French culpability. "The evidence is irrefutable," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who controlled European monetary policy. French government resources were systematically used to manipulate markets across the European Union. What Prime Minister Sunak did wasn't just financially responsible, it may have prevented a complete collapse of European banking confidence. The final blow came with Lagarde's revelation that the European Central Bank was considering emergency sanctions against France while simultaneously offering Britain a special economic partnership that would essentially restore many pre-Brexit financial privileges. Sometimes, Lagarde concluded, integrity matters more than institutional membership. Britain has demonstrated both financial capability and moral leadership. Europe needs partners like that regardless of political arrangements. That evening, as Sunak prepared to address the British people from the steps of Downing Street, he reflected on how completely the dynamics had shifted. 24 hours earlier, Britain had been under coordinated financial attack. Now Britain was being courted as Europe's potential savior, while France faced international isolation and economic sanctions. The crowds gathered outside Downing Street as news of the developing crisis spread through London's financial district and beyond. British citizens who had spent years hearing about their country's diminished post-Brexit relevance were now watching their Prime Minister emerge as the leader who had single-handedly prevented a European financial collapse while exposing systematic corruption at the highest levels of continental politics. Television crews from around the world positioned themselves along Whitehall as Sunak stepped up to the podium that had been hastily erected on the famous black doorsteps. His appearance was deliberately understated. A simple dark suit, no ceremonial decorations, just the quiet confidence of someone who had outmaneuvered one of Europe's most sophisticated political operators. Today, Britain faced a choice. Sunak began, his voice carrying easily across the assembled crowd and the microphones broadcasting his words globally. We could have responded to attack with attack, to manipulation with manipulation, to betrayal with betrayal. Instead, we chose a different path. Behind the cameras, French diplomatic officials were visible in the crowd. Their presence a reminder that this crisis had immediate international implications. Sunak could see them taking notes, probably preparing reports for their superiors about how thoroughly their president's strategy had backfired. We chose to save European markets not because we sought credit, but because collapse would have hurt ordinary people across the continent who had done nothing wrong. We chose transparency over secrecy, cooperation over conspiracy, principle over profit. The speech was being broadcast live across Europe, where millions were watching the leader of the country they had celebrated leaving the European Union now explaining why he had risked British resources to save European financial stability. In Paris, polls showed Macron's approval ratings collapsing in real time as voters realized the extent of his market manipulation. Some will say that Britain should not have intervened in European affairs, Sunak continued. They will argue that we gave up our voice in European decisions when we left the European Union. But moral leadership doesn't require institutional membership. Doing the right thing doesn't require anyone's permission. The crowd began applauding, but Sunak raised his hand for silence. He wasn't finished, and the next part of his speech would reshape European politics for decades to come. President Macron called me 3 nights ago asking for help. What he didn't tell me was that he was the one who had created the crisis he wanted me to solve. What he didn't expect was that Britain would help anyway, because that's who we are as a nation. French media outlets were already reporting the political earthquake unfolding in Paris, where Macron's own party members were calling for his resignation and opposition leaders were demanding criminal investigations. The man who had positioned himself as Europe's intellectual leader was now facing potential prosecution for financial crimes. Today we learned something important about the difference between leadership and manipulation, between partnership and exploitation, between strength and bullying, Sunak concluded. Britain didn't save Europe to prove our worth. We did it because it was right, and that distinction will define the kind of nation we choose to be in the years ahead. As the crowd dispersed, Sunak's phone buzzed with messages from world leaders. The President of the United States wanted to discuss enhanced financial cooperation. The Japanese Prime Minister was interested in expanded trade relationships. Even the Chinese Premier had sent congratulations on what he called principled leadership in financial affairs. But the most significant message came from an unexpected source. A coalition of European Parliament members announcing their intention to propose formal censure of the French president while simultaneously inviting Britain to consider a new form of economic partnership that would transcend traditional EU membership structures. The student had indeed become the teacher. But more importantly, integrity had triumphed over manipulation in a way that would reshape global finance for generations to come. 3 weeks after the crisis that would become known as Macron's gamble, the political landscape of Europe had been fundamentally redrawn. Emmanuel Macron, once hailed as the intellectual voice of European integration, now faced criminal investigations in 3 countries and calls for his resignation from across the political spectrum. His approval ratings had collapsed to historic lows, with even his own party members distancing themselves from what French media had dubbed la trahison financière, the financial betrayal. Rishi Sunak, meanwhile, found himself in the unprecedented position of being Europe's most trusted leader, despite Britain's non-membership in the European Union. International confidence in London's financial sector had reached new heights. British markets were outperforming all European indices, and Brexit critics found themselves questioning fundamental assumptions about Britain's diminished role in global affairs. The transformation was perhaps most visible in the halls of the European Parliament, where members who had once celebrated Britain's departure now spoke openly about the need for new frameworks that could accommodate British leadership without traditional institutional membership. A proposal for a Commonwealth of democratic economies was gaining support across party lines, essentially creating a parallel structure to the EU that would be led by principles rather than geography. But the most telling moment came during Sunak's final conversation with Macron. The call came at 10 p.m. on a Thursday evening, 3 weeks after the crisis had begun. Macron's voice was barely above a whisper, the theatrical confidence completely drained from his tone. "Rishi, perhaps we can still salvage this situation, find some way to work together moving forward." There was something almost pitiful in the French president's voice, the sound of a man watching his political legacy crumble in real time. French prosecutors had frozen several of his personal accounts pending investigation, his closest advisors were being arrested one by one, and his own party was preparing to select a new leader for the upcoming elections. "Emmanuel," Sunak replied, his voice carrying no malice but absolute finality, "you taught me something invaluable about leadership. You showed me that true strength comes not from destroying others, but from building something better than what existed before." He paused, looking out at the London skyline where lights twinkled in windows of banks and trading floors that had just demonstrated their continued relevance to global finance. "You tried to weaken Britain to strengthen France. Instead, you weakened France to strengthen Britain. But more importantly, you showed the world what happens when leaders prioritize personal ambition over public service." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for nearly 30 seconds before Macron spoke again. "History will judge whether what you did was right." "History is already judging," Sunak replied. "And the verdict is clear. Britain will prosper. Europe will recover. But your reputation, that's something only you can repair, and I suspect it's too late for that." After hanging up, Sunak walked to his study where framed photographs of his daughters reminded him why integrity and leadership mattered beyond politics or personal ambition. Tomorrow he would announce the formal launch of the Democratic Economies Alliance, a new framework for international cooperation that prioritized transparency, mutual benefit, and principled leadership over geographical proximity or historical grievances. The alliance already included commitments from 12 countries across 4 continents, nations that had watched Britain's response to the Macron crisis and decided they wanted to be associated with that kind of principled leadership. 6 months later, as Sunak stood before the United Nations General Assembly announcing Britain's new role in global financial stability, he reflected on how dramatically the world had changed. What had begun as an attempted financial assassination had become the foundation for a new form of international cooperation based on shared values rather than shared borders. The lesson was profound and would echo through diplomatic history. In the modern world, moral authority mattered more than institutional power, and nations that prioritized principle over profit would ultimately shape the global order. Emmanuel Macron had tried to teach Britain its place in the world. Instead, he had learned his own.